The cull pit grate was still ringing when I got there, and the thing inside it hit the bars again hard enough to bow the steel toward my face. I was 12. I had run from the waterline with the empty pails still banging my knees because the whole settlement had gone to the pit fence the way people go to a fire, and a boy will always run toward the thing the grown ones are afraid of. Through the gap in the legs and robes I saw it, a dust cat, a rain, the threll called them, though out on the plains the haulers just said duster, the way you say a word you don't want to say twice. It was the color of the ground after a burn, tawny going to ash along the spine, and it was the biggest living thing I had ever stood near, bigger than the breeding bulls in the pens. It threw itself at the bars a third time, and the men with the shock poles fell back even though there was a finger of plated steel between them and it, and the warden's voice came up over the noise like a man reading a sentence. "Note the time," Warden Tolek said. He was Threll, gray ridged down the skull, tall the way they all are, and he held a slate the way some men hold a knife. Note that it took the handler's 3 fingers through the feed slot. Note that it has now killed or maimed across 2 seasons, and that no collar, no muzzle rig, no conditioning cycle is held. The colony does not keep what it cannot govern. "It's going to be put down," a woman near me said. Not to me, just saying it. "About time. That thing ate a man." I should have agreed, everyone agreed, but I was watching its eye, the near one, amber gone almost to copper, and it was not the eye of a thing that had lost its mind. It was the eye of a thing that had decided something and was waiting to be proven right. It found me at the fence. It stopped throwing itself at the bars. It just looked at me, and the whole pit got quiet in that way a room gets quiet when something has happened that nobody has words for yet. "Move the boy back," Tolek said. A hand came down on my shoulder, my mother's, and I want to be honest about her here because people who didn't know Sella Marsh think she must have been a soft woman to let what happened happen. She was not soft. She had held our claim through 2 dust seasons with my father out on the long hauls, with my sister Pell barely past her 7th year, and she had buried more than she ever said. Her hand on my shoulder was not pulling me back. It was steadying me the way you steady a thing you have decided to trust. "That's the man-eater," she said, low, "just for me. You hearing me, Eli?" "I hear you," I said. The rain lay down. It did it slowly, the way a tired man lowers himself into a chair, front legs first, the great head coming to rest between its paws, and it kept that copper eye on me the whole way down. 40 colonists at that fence, and it had not lain down for any of them, and it lay down for a boy who had run up with 2 empty pails. I heard the shock poles lower. I heard Tolek stop reading. "Get it up," the warden said to his handlers, and his voice had changed, just slightly. The way a man's voice changes when the script he memorized is no longer the script being played. "Get it on its feet." We do this on the record, standing. They could not get it up. They cracked the poles against the bars, and it did not so much as flick an ear. It lay there breathing, ribs going slow, and it watched me, and after a while it did a thing that I have spent a long life trying to describe to people who weren't there. It rolled, just enough to show me the long pale fur of its throat. To an animal, that is the most foolish thing in the world. The throat is the thing you guard with your life. It showed me its throat across a steel grate in front of the people who had come to kill it, and I understood, the way a child understands things, before he has the words, that it was not surrendering to me. It was telling me it had chosen its ground. "It's hungry," someone said, to make it small. "It thinks the boy's got meat. He's got empty pails," my mother said, and that shut them up. Tolek keyed his slate. "The cull proceeds on schedule," he said. "First light. The animal is condemned. This is colony business and not theater. Disperse the fence." He looked at me when he said theater, because I was the part of it he could not file, and a man like Tolek hated nothing in this life so much as a thing he could not file. That should have been the end of it. A boy sees a doomed animal. The animal does a strange thing. The morning comes, and the strange thing is forgotten under the weight of how the world actually works. I have watched that exact ending happen to 100 small wonders. But I went home that night, and I did not sleep, and somewhere past the middle of the dark I got up, and I took the cold haunch of grazer that was meant to be our 3-day meat, and I went out the kitchen hatch into the cold and the blowing grit, and I walked the half-mile to the cull pit alone. I want you to understand what kind of cold it is out there in the dust season. On a death world, the survey's rated too hard for anything but stubborn people. It gets into the seams of you. The night sky over Coldwater Reach is not black. It is a low brown ceiling of blowing dust lit from beneath by the perimeter lamps, and the wind never fully stops. It only changes its mind. I walked through that with a frozen haunch of meat against my chest like a fool, and the perimeter lamp at the pit threw my shadow long and thin ahead of me, and I came up to the bars where I had no business being, with no grown soul knowing where I was. It was awake. Of course it was awake. It was sitting up now. That great head turned to me before I had crossed the last of the open ground, and I understood that it had heard me or smelled me or known me coming the whole way. I stopped at the bars. The shock poles were racked on the wall where the handlers had left them. There was no grown thing within a half-mile of us, just a boy and a condemned apex predator and a frozen haunch of meat in the wind. "I brought you something," I said, which is a foolish thing to say to a thing that eats men, but I was 12. I pushed the haunch through the feed slot, the same slot that had taken a handler's fingers, and I did not pull my hand back fast the way you're taught. I don't know why. I think I had decided, the way it had decided, and I wasn't going to take it back. The rain came forward. It put its nose at the meat. Then it put its nose to my hand, my whole small hand, and its breath was hot, and it smelled of iron and dust, and it did not close its jaws. It pressed its broad brow against my palm, once hard, the way our old herd dog used to lean its whole weight on your leg when it had decided you were its person. "Easy," I told it. I kept my voice low, and even the way you do with a spook grazer, the way my mother spoke when the night was bad. "Easy now, I've got you." It made a sound then, deep in the chest, a rolling, grinding sound that I felt in my own ribs more than heard, and it took me a moment to understand that this enormous condemned killer was purring. It ate the haunch in 4 bites with me sitting against the bars, and then it lay down with its spine to the steel as close to me as the grate would. Let it come, and it put that great head down, and it slept. It had not slept, the handler said later, in the 11 days it had been in the pit. It slept that night with a boy on the other side of the bars, and I sat in the killing cold with my back to the steel and my coat against its fur, through the gap, and I think that is the night it stopped being the colony's man-eater and became mine. His name became Cinder because of how he looked when the first grit light came up gray over the pit, ash and ember, the color of a fire that thinks it has gone out and hasn't. I named him before the call bell rang. I have thought about that a great deal in the years since. I named him knowing they meant to kill him at first light, the way you'd name a thing you mean to keep. They came for the cull at first light and found me inside the fence, not inside the pit. I want that clear, because the story got told fat and wrong in the years after. I was inside the outer fence, at the bars, asleep against the steel with my coat snagged in the grate, and Cinder was up before any of them, on his feet between me and the gate, and the sound he made when Warden Tolik's handler put a hand to the latch was not the sound he had made for me in the night. The men with the shock poles came through the outer gate and stopped like they'd hit a wall. I woke to my mother's voice, which had crossed that half-mile faster than I would have believed, and to the warden saying, very carefully, "The way you talk near a thing that has decided to kill you, boy, you will stand up slowly and you will walk to me." "He won't hurt me," I said. I was still half asleep. I put my hand back through the bars, and Cinder leaned the side of his head into it without ever taking his copper eyes off. The men, and I heard one of the handlers say a threll word my mother wouldn't translate. "It maimed the last handler who touched it," Tolik said. "He's not touching you," I said. "I'm touching him." I have replayed that morning more times than any morning of my life, and the thing I remember best is not the fear on the men's faces, though there was plenty of it. It is the warden's slate, which he had brought to record the cull, hanging forgotten in his hand at his side, while a condemned man-eater stood guard over a sleeping human, child and would not be moved on the record, in front of 40 witnesses, with the killing cold coming off the plains and the perimeter lamps going pale in the dawn. "The colony does not keep what it cannot govern," he had said. And here was the thing he could not govern, governed entire by a boy with empty pails, lying down for one of us and rising for one of us, and nothing in his slate had a slot for it. "The cull is suspended," he said at last, because there was nothing else to say that would not have ended with one of his men in pieces. "Pending review." I learned the word review that morning. I learned it the way you learn a word you are going to spend a season fighting. The review took 9 days, and in those 9 days I learned how a colony talks itself in circles around a thing it is afraid of. They could not kill him, because a man-eater that lay down for a child made for the worst kind of trouble, the kind that gets argued at the council fire and remembered wrong. They could not free him, because he was a condemned apex predator, and freeing him would have been madness by every line in the warden's slate. And they could not move him to a far station, because the only thing that kept him from tearing the pit apart was me, sitting at the bars every morning before the water line and every evening after, and you cannot ship a boy with a beast and call it a solution. So they did the thing colonies do. They formed a committee. Warden Tolik chaired it, and he came to it every day having lost a little more of the certainty he'd had at the cull pit, and he hated me for it the way a man hates the small stone that has lamed his good horse. "It is conditioning the child," he told the council. On the 3rd day, in the long hall where the heat lamps buzzed and the colony's 3 species sat in their separate clusters and watched a human boy stand accused of being chosen. "Predators do this. It marks a keeper. It is not affection, it is acquisition." The animal has acquired the boy the way it would acquire a den or a kill, and it will defend its acquisition until the day the boy is no longer useful, and on that day it will eat him. Then it's had 3 feeds and 9 nights to eat me, I said, before my mother could put her hand on my arm, and it hasn't, sir. The Oru traders made the small clicking sound that was their laughing, 4 eyes blinking out of sequence, and Tolek's ridge went the dark gray that meant a thrall was angry, and I had made an enemy properly then, 12 years old and fool enough to be proud of it. But it was a Vant who saved Cinder in the end, and I have always loved the Vant for it. They are the heavy laborers of the frontier colonies, slab-shouldered and slow-spoken, and they work the deep pens and the grazer lines, and they know animals the way the warden knew slates. Their pen chief was an old male named Brook, and on the 5th day Brook stood up in the long hall, which the Vant almost never did, and he said in his ground-down voice, "I have worked the dust cats 40 seasons. I have lost 2 brothers to them. The warden is right that you do not govern a reign. He is wrong about the rest. A reign does not acquire. A reign chooses once, for life, and what it chooses it does not eat." We had a saying in the deep pens before the warden's people came with their slates. We said a reign is the only honest thing on this world, because it will tell you to your face whether it has chosen you, and it has never once lied. He looked at me and then at Tolek. "That animal has chosen. You can kill it, warden. You cannot unchoose it. And if you kill a thing that has chosen a child of this colony, in front of the child, you had best be very sure your slate has a line for what that does to the people who watch." The hall was quiet after that, the way the pit had been quiet. They ruled on the 9th day. The reign-designated specimen 11 would be released from the cull on a probationary keeping, bonded to the human miner Eli Marsh and the Marsh claim, under the full liability of the household, subject to immediate destruction on any incident of harm to a colonist. Warden Tolek read it out himself, every cold word of it, and when he was done he looked down the hall at me and said, "I give it a season. I give it until the dust runs and the night runners come and your mother's claim cannot feed it. Then you will bring it to me yourself, boy, and you will hold it while I do what should have been done at first light. Write that down somewhere." I did. I'm writing it down now. We walked him home that evening, Cinder and me, with the whole settlement watching from doorways and the long mile of perimeter fence behind us, and he walked at my left hand the way he would walk at my left hand for the rest of his life, his shoulder at the height of my head, his great paws making no sound at all in the grit. My mother walked on my other side with the old slug thrower she kept for the pens, not pointed at anything, just held, because she was a careful woman, and being chosen by a creature is not the same as it being safe to turn your back on it. It never harmed us. I want to put that plainly here, ahead of everything else that happened, because the warden's people spent a season waiting for the incident that would let them finish the cull, and the incident never came. Cinder slept across the kitchen hatch where the cold came in, and Pell, my sister, 7 years old and afraid of nothing because she had never been given a reason, Pell slept against his flank within the week, curled into the ash-colored fur with her thumb in her mouth, and the great copper-eyed killer the colony had condemned would lie there all night, without shifting his weight, breathing slow, so as not to wake the smallest of us. I learned his rules the way you learn a person's. He would not eat until I had eaten. He watched me lift the first bite every meal, and only then would he touch his own. He would not pass through a door ahead of me. When my mother raised her voice, not at me, just the ordinary sharpness of a tired woman running a hard claim, his head would come up and his eyes would find me checking, and when I shook my head a little, just a little, he would put his head back down. He learned the word easy before he learned his own name. I would say it low, and even when the grit storms came howling against the shutters and Pell would cry, and he would press his brow to mine, hard, the way he had through the bars that first night, and the rolling grind would come up in his chest, and the storm did not seem so loud after that. The keeping ruling required us to register him at the colony commons in person before the warden's clerk, which meant walking a man-eater the length of the main settlement past every doorway in Coldwater Reach. And Tolek made very sure the registration was set for market day, when the commons was full, because a careful enemy chooses his ground too. I think he wanted the colony to see the thing up close and remember to be afraid of it. I think he wanted a child to walk a killer through a crowd of his own people and let the crowd do the work the slate could not. We walked him through, my mother on one side and me on the other, and Cinder at my left hand, his shoulder at my head, his great paws silent in the grit, and the market commons went quiet ahead of us the way a field goes quiet before weather. The Oru traders stopped their haggling. The human haulers put their hands near the things men put their hands near. A Vant child, too young to have learned the fear, broke from its mother and toddled out into the open lane straight at the enormous ash-colored predator the way small things will, and the whole commons drew one breath and held it. Cinder stopped. He lowered his great head to the level of the little thing, slow, and the Vant child put both its small hands flat on his broad nose, and Cinder held still as a stone and let it, his copper eyes coming up sideways to find me checking the way he always checked. I said low and even, "Easy, he's all right. You can let him be patted, easy now." And the mother came and gathered her child up off the nose of a condemned man-eater in the middle of the market. Shaking, and Cinder lifted his head and walked on at my hand, and behind us the commons let its breath out all at once. And something in the colony shifted that day that no ruling could have shifted, because a thing they had been told was a man-eater had been handed a child's bare hands in front of 40 witnesses and had given them back the child. The warden's clerk registered him in a voice that would not stay steady. Tulloch watched from the gallery rail, and I looked up at him once, and his ridge was the flat, colorless gray of a thrall who has played a card and watched it lose, and I learned that day that a man can be made smaller by the thing he stages to make him larger. He had wanted the crowd to fear the beast. The crowd had watched the beast be gentle with their smallest, and a colony does not forget a thing like that, and it does not forgive the man who arranged for them to see it. The colony came around to him slowly and never all the way, which I have decided is the honest way for a colony to come around to anything. The Vant came around first. Brooke would come by the claim of an evening and sit on the step and watch Cinder the way you watch a sunset, saying nothing, and once he said, 40 seasons. I never saw one choose, and that was the whole of the conversation, and it was enough. The Oru traders came around because Cinder was good for their stories, and a frontier trader lives on stories. The Thrall, Tulloch's people, did not come around, and they did not have to, because the dust season was coming, and the warden was a patient man, and patient men do not need to win arguments. They only need to wait for the world to win them. The warden made one more try before the season turned, and it came dressed as science. The colonial authority kept a beast behaviorist on the regional station, a thin, precise thrall named Veshan, who studied bonded death world predators and wrote the reports Tulloch was forever quoting in the long hall, and the warden sent for her, I have no doubt, in the hope that an expert would put on the record what his ruling could not. That the bond was a danger, that the clock was running, that the boy was a fool sleeping beside a loaded thing. She came out to our claim on a hauler's flatbed with a case of instruments and a great deal of certainty, and she sat up at our table and asked her questions, and then she asked to observe the specimen. She observed him a long while. She had a scent reader and a stress gauge and a slate of her own, and she ran them, and I watched her face do the thing the warden's clerk's voice had done at the registration. I watched it stop trusting its instruments. She had me put Cinder through the small ordinary business of an evening, the meal he would not start until I had, the door he would not pass ahead of me, the way his head came up at a sharp voice and his eyes came to me to check. She had me say the settling word and watched him press his brow to mine. She put her own hand out, on her own judgment, palm down, the way the Vant do, and Cinder took her measure and let her touch the rough fur of his jaw, and her gauge, she said, read calm. Calmer, she said, than any bonded apex she had logged. "You understand what you are looking at," Brock said to her from the step. It was not quite a question. "I am looking at a clean fixation bond," Veshan said, "in an adult rain formed in a single imprinting event under extreme stress. The literature says this should not hold. The literature says an adult apex does not imprint, and that where it appears to, the bond degrades and the animal redirects its aggression to the keeper inside 2 seasons. She put her instruments down, slow, and she looked at me, and then at Cinder, and then she said the thing the warden had not sent her to say. "I have written a great deal of that literature. I am going to have to write some of it again. This animal is not going to turn. I would stake the station on it. Whatever is between this child and this creature, it is older than my instruments, and my instruments are the best the authority has." She gathered her case. "I will file that finding. The warden will not like it." The warden did not like it. He had reached for an expert to close the door on Cinder, and the expert had filed a finding that pried it open wider than any of us could have. Managed, on the authority's own letterhead, in the authority's own words, that the man-eater would not turn, that the bond would hold, that the slate had been wrong about the one thing it was surest of. It is the oldest mistake a certain kind of man makes, the warden's mistake, the mistake I would watch men make all my life. He was so sure the truth was on his side that he kept sending for it, and the truth kept arriving and standing with the boy. The world had a way of winning arguments on Coldwater Reach, and its name was the Night Runners. I should tell you about the Night Runners before I tell you what they did, because if you didn't grow up on a Dust Plains death world, you will picture the wrong thing. They are not large. That is the first wrong thing people picture. They are about the size of a lean hound, dun-colored, flat to the ground, and they come with the deep dust season the way the cold comes. in numbers off the open plains where nothing else can live. The surveys called them a migratory pursuit predator. The haulers called them the tide because that is how they move, low and wide and without a front edge, and because when they have you, there is no more arguing with them than with the sea. A grown male alone you could kill with a boot and a bad word. 40 of them flowing under your fence in the dark while the storm covers their noise will strip a grazer pen to bone and bring the bones inside to you. The colony's whole shape was built against them. The perimeter fence, the killing lamps that ran all night in the season, the shutter drills we ran until Pell could throw the kitchen bolt in her sleep, the warden's pride and joy, a ring of automated perimeter wardens, squat weapon drones on tracks that Tollick had requisitioned at great cost from the colonial authority, that were meant to hold the fence so the people wouldn't have to. He spoke of them in the long haul the way other men speak of sons. The drones would hold the line, he said. The drones did not tire, did not sleep, did not freeze, did not flinch. The drones would make the old hard nights a memory. He had a slate line for everything the drones would do. He did not have a slate line for the night they didn't. But that was still a season off, and in the meantime Cinder grew into the claim the way a key grows into a lock. He took to walking the perimeter with me when I ran the dusk check on the grazer pens, and the grazers, who should have lost their minds at an apex predator in their midst, went quiet and clustered toward him, because every prey animal on that world knew down in its blood what Cinder was, and knew the difference between a hunter that is hunting and a hunter that has decided you are under its eye. I have watched a pen of grazers walk toward the thing that was built to eat them, because they had read, faster than any committee, the one fact the warden never could, that Cinder had chosen, and that everything the boy loved was now inside the circle of his choosing. The first time I understood what that circle meant, it was not the night runners at all. It was a man. There was a man on the frontier named Hask, a scrap runner who worked the dead claims out past the perimeter, the kind of man a colony tolerates because he buys his drink and pays his fines, and nobody can quite prove the thing they all know about him. What they all knew about Hask was that claims went empty near him, and the people who'd held them went out on the plains and didn't come back, and the dust season covered a great deal. He came to our claim on an ordinary evening with a story about a strayed grazer and a price he was willing to pay for it, and I knew before he'd finished the first sentence that the grazer was a lie, because Cinder had come up off the kitchen step without a sound and put himself between the man and the door, and the rolling grind in his chest was there, but it was not the warm one. It was lower. It was the one I would come to know. My mother knew it too. She came to the doorway with Pell behind her skirt and the slug thrower not yet raised, and she said very level, "We've no strayed stock, Hask. You'll want to be off the claim before full dark. The season's turning." "Now there's no call to be unfriendly," Hask said, and he took a step toward the door, toward the woman and the small girl, the easy step of a man who has done a thing many times and found it simple. Cinder did not lunge. I have told this part to men who do not believe me, who think a beast that big and that deadly must come in like an avalanche. All at once. He did not. He flowed. One moment he was at the step, and the next he was a body length in front of Hask with his great head dropped, level and his lips off his teeth, and he had not made a sound past that low grind, and Hask's foot, which had been coming down toward my mother's threshold, went back instead, and kept going back, because the man's whole body had understood the situation a long second before his pride caught up to it. "Call it off," Hask said. His voice had gone high. "Boy, call it off. It's right at me. Call it off." "He's not at you," I said, and I came and stood at Cinder's left shoulder, my hand in the fur of his neck, which I could feel had gone hard as cable under the softness. "He's between you and them. There's a difference. You take a step back, he stays. You take a step toward that door, sir, and I don't think there's a thing in this world that calls him off." Hask took a step back. He took a great many steps back, all the way to the perimeter gate and out of it, walking backward most of the way because he would not turn his spine to us, and Cinder walked him out at the pace of a man retreating, never closing, never quite letting the gap grow, herding him off the claim the way a good dog moves stock, except there was nothing of the dog in it. There was only the patience of a thing that has decided you are leaving and is curious, mildly, whether you will be foolish about it. At the gate Hask found his courage, the cheap kind, the kind that needs a fence between. "That thing's a man-eater," he shouted back across the dust. "Everybody knows it. One night it'll turn on the brats, and the warden'll do what he should have done at the pit. You hear me, you stupid woman? You've put a killer in with your children." "I have," my mother agreed, and I heard the thing under her voice that I did not have the years yet to. Name the thing that was almost laughter and was not laughter at all, and he's never once bared a tooth at them. "Can you say the same, Hask? About the men you drink with?" Hask went out into the dark, and the dark that season was an unkind place for a man to be alone with a guilty conscience. and we never did see him again. And the warden's slate recorded him as departed frontier, and no one looked very hard. Cinder came back to the step. He pressed his brow to mine hard, and the grind in his chest had gone warm again. And Pell came out from behind my mother's skirts and threw her arms around as much of his neck as her arms would hold, and he stood and let her, the killer the colony had condemned, while the perimeter lamps came up against the falling night. That was the night I understood the circle. Not the night I learned the word, but the night I understood it. Inside the circle of his choosing, me, my mother, my sister, the claim, the grazers in the pens, Cinder was the gentlest thing I have ever known. Gentle the way only something genuinely lethal can afford to be, with nothing to prove and nothing to fear. And the edge of that circle was an absolute and terrible line, and any creature that meant to cross it toward the things he loved would find, in the last second before it was too late, that it had badly misjudged what kind of world it was standing in. It was Brooke, the old Vant Pen chief, who gave the thing its name. He'd come by the next evening, as he did, and I'd told him about Hask, and Brooke sat on the step a long while in the way the Vant have turning it over. Then he said, "You see how he did not roar, how he did not leap. A young rain roars. A young rain wants the world to know. An old one that is chosen, it goes quiet, and it puts itself between, and it lets the low word do the work." He nodded slowly, the deep Vant nod that takes its time. In the old pens we had a name for the way a chosen rain carries itself, the way the whole storm of it goes down into one quiet line and waits. We called it the settling word. He looked at me from under the heavy ridge of his brow. "You've a settling word in you, boy." He heard it through the bars. That's the whole of it. The colony spent 11 days trying to govern a thing that was only ever waiting to hear a steady voice tell it easy, the settling word. I have heard learned people on the core worlds talk about the bond between a human and a death world. Apex as if it were a chemistry, a thing of scent markers and dominance hierarchies and conditioning windows, and maybe it is in a lab on a slate. Out on the dust plains we had the older and the truer name, and the name was a thing a frightened animal hears in the dark from the one creature in all the world that has decided not to be afraid of it. Easy, now, I've got you. The settling word was never a command. It was a promise, and Cinder had heard it through the bars of a killing pit on the night before they meant to kill him, and he had decided to spend the rest of his life keeping his half of it. Word of the settling word got around the colony the way words do, and by the deep of the season the Vant had taken to using it without quite knowing they were. The slab-shouldered laborers murmuring easy, settle, to the spooked stock in the deep pens in a low even register that was not how they'd spoken to animals before, because they'd watched the boy do it to a man-eater and live. Even some of the human haulers picked it up. It became, in that small way the frontier has of making doctrine out of one true thing it has seen with its own eyes, the colony's name for the calm that holds when everything wants to break. I did not know, that season, how much we would need it. I saw it take hold in the deep pens, which is the part of it I love best to remember. Brooke had begun against every protocol on the warden's slate to let me bring Cinder into the deep stock pens of an evening, because a rain in the pens did a thing no Vant crew with shock prods could do. It settled the grazers. The herd, which should have stampeded itself to death at the scent of an apex, instead drew in and went quiet under his eye, the way prey goes still and safe under the one hunter that has claimed it, and a quiet herd is a herd that does not break its legs against the rails. The warden would have had a fit if he'd seen it. Brooke did not tell him, and neither did I. There was a night a breeding bull went bad in the chute. They do, the big males, when the dust gets in their lungs and the season turns them mean, and a bull in a chute is a thing that kills men, 2 tons of panic in a steel box with nowhere to put it but through whatever is nearest. The Vant crew had the prods on it, and the prods were making it worse. The way force always makes a frightened thing worse. And Brooke called them off and looked at me, and I climbed up on the chute rail with Cinder below me at the gate, and I dropped my voice into the low even register and I said it, "Easy, easy now, settle, I've got you." And Cinder took it up the only way he could, by putting himself where the bull couldn't see him and going still, the great calm weight of him at the gate, and the bull's eye rolled to the apex predator at its gate and found instead of one more thing trying to hurt it, a thing that was simply, enormously unbothered, and the panic went out of it. It went out of it all at once the way a held breath goes. The bull stood in the chute, shaking and breathing and did not die, and the crew got the gate, and Brooke stood there in the pen light with the strangest look on his heavy face. 40 seasons, he said, for the 100th time that year, and then he said the thing that fixed it for the colony. We have been doing this with prods. We have been doing this with force, because force was what we had. The boy and the cat do it with a steady voice and a body in the gap. That's the settling word. Not the voice alone, mind. The voice and the body in the gap. The promise that the thing in the dark is someone standing between it and the thing it fears. He looked at his crew, the slab-shouldered men who had watched a man-eater unmake a killing panic without a tooth bared. Learn it. It will keep more stock alive than 100 prods, and one day it may keep more than stock. They learned it. By the deep of the season, you could not work the pens at Coldwater Reach without hearing the low even register pass crew to crew. Easy, settle, hold, a body in the gap and a steady voice, the settling word, and the men who used it did not always remember it had started with a boy and a condemned animal on a bad night, with a bull in a chute. That is how you know a thing has become true. It stops being a story about anyone and starts being the way things are done. The warden, for his part, watched all of it with the patience of a man who has read the weather. He did not move against Cinder. He did not have to. The deep dust was coming, the season the surveys marked in hard red on the colony almanac, and the warden had his ring of drones and his slate full of certainties, and he had said it himself in the long haul. The claim could not feed a rain through the deep, and the night runners would come, and on that night one of two things would happen. Either the man-eater would turn, hungry and cornered, and finish the cull for him in front of the people who had been fool enough to doubt his judgment, or it would not turn, and it would simply be one more mouth on a claim that could not hold. One more thing the night runners would strip to bone while a useless boy clung to it and called it easy. He had a slate line for both. He did not have a slate line for what actually came, and I have come to believe, in the long years since, that this is the whole and only lesson of that season, the thing I would carry off the dust plains and into a life. That the men who are surest they have a line for everything are exactly the men the world is laying its trap for, and that the things they have condemned and filed and ruled upon are exactly the things that will, on the worst night of all, stand in the gap they cannot fill and hold. The night runners gave us their first warning a half-month before the deep, the way they always do, a thin probe at the start of the season. A few outriders come ahead of the tide to read the colony's fences and learn its arcs. The colony knew the pattern and braced for it, and the warden's drones turned out for their first real night, and the colony stood at the fence behind them and waited. The probe came at the south arc, a dozen runners, no more, low and spread, testing. The drones lit them up out in the open where the arcs reached and put down 4 or 5 in the first pass, and there was a ragged cheer along the fence. Men slapping the cold housings of the drones the way you'd slap the neck of a horse that has run well, and Tollick stood at the south gate with his slate and let himself be seen being right. For a moment that night, I believed in the drones too, the way you believe in a thing that is working in front of you. But 2 runners had read the arc on the first pass, and they did the thing the tide would do 9 days early at full scale. They went wide, into the dead ground between the south drone and the southeast, the gap the overlapping arcs were supposed to cover and didn't quite, and they were through the fence line and into the near grazer pen before any coil so much as swung their way. I was at the south fence with Cinder when it happened, and he was gone from my hand before I understood why, flowing low along the inside of the fence toward the pen, ash on ash in the dark. He took the first runner in the pen mouth without a sound. The second turned to run. They are not brave, the runners not 1-to-1. The tide is their only courage, and Cinder did not chase it out into the open where the drones might, in their confusion, have put a coil through him. As readily as through it, he turned it. He cut its angle and turned it back along the fence and broke it against the very gate where the warden stood, a body length from Tollick's polished boots. And then he stood over it in the drone light, with his copper eyes coming up the length of the fence to find me, checking the way he always checked, and the cheering along the fence had stopped. 2 runners through the line on the very first night of the season, through the dead ground a slate had called sufficient, and the only thing between them and the grazers, between them and the children sleeping 2 claims deep, had been a condemned man-eater that the warden had ruled would be destroyed on any incident. The colony did the arithmetic standing right there at the fence, in the cold, with the proof of it bleeding out at the warden's feet. I saw the men look from the drones to Cinder and back, and I saw the thing pass down the line without a word being said, the thing that is worth more than any ruling on a frontier. They had just watched the slate's certainty go wide into the dark, and they had watched the condemned thing close the gap. "Note the time," I said, before I could stop myself, low, just loud enough for the gate. I was 12, and I should not have said it, and I have never once been sorry. Brooke, down the fence, made the ground-down sound that was of ant laughing, and Tollick's ridge went dark. And the warden wrote nothing on his slate that night that I ever heard read aloud. He had his certainty back by morning, the way proud men do. The probe was a probe, he said. The drones had accounted for the bulk of it. The 2 through the gap were an acceptable margin. The system performed to specification. He had a slate line for all of it, and the slate line was even true. In the small, bloodless way a slate is true. The grazers were alive, and the colony was whole, and the season had opened the way the almanac said it would. He went back to his patience and his weather reading, and I went back to running the dusk check with my hand in Cinder's fur, and the colony went back to its work, and the thing that had passed down the fence line went quiet but did not go away. It only waited, the way the true things wait, for the night the slate line would not be enough. The deep dust came 9 days early. That was the first thing that went wrong. Everything after it went wrong faster. The almanac had the deep dust marked for the turn of the long month, and a colony plans its whole survival around that mark. The shutter drills, the stockpiling, the drawing in of the far claims behind the perimeter. 9 days early meant the far claims hadn't drawn in yet. It meant 3 households were still out past the fence when the brown wall came off the plains at dusk, and the perimeter lamps went from white to the deep amber that means visibility is gone. I was at the grazer pens with Cinder when it hit, running the dusk check, and he felt it before I did. His head came up off my hand and turned to the open plains, and the grind started in his chest, the low one, and his whole body went still in the way that on him meant the opposite of calm. I had learned to read him by then the way you read a barometer. When Cinder went still and faced the dark had something in it. Easy, I told him, on reflex, and put my hand back in his fur. Easy now. It's just the storm coming early. It was not just the storm. The storm was only the thing the night runners were coming behind. That is their oldest trick and the death world's oldest cruelty. The tide moves under the dust, screened by the same brown ceiling that blinds the lamps and chokes the sensors, and by the time the colony understands what the early storm is carrying, the tide is already at the fence. We got the grazers penned and the gates thrown, and I ran for the house with Cinder, a shadow at my left hand. And the colony alarm started up across the settlement, the deep two-note that meant runners on the perimeter, and I heard the warden's drones spin up out along the fence line, the high whine of their tracks and their target coils, and for one moment, I'll be honest, for one moment I believed in them. The whine of them was a confident sound. It sounded like a thing that had a line for everything. Here is what no one had a line for. The night runners had come early because the night runners had learned. The colony had run its drones for 2 seasons in the same ring on the same tracks, firing on the same heat and motion profile, and the tide that came that night came low, and came spread, and came not at the fence but at the gaps between the drone's arcs, the dead ground the warden's clever ring had never quite been built to cover, because a slate had said the overlapping arcs were sufficient, and a slate had never had 40 starving pursuit predators reading the geometry of its arcs in the dark. The first I knew the drones had failed was the sound of one of them firing into the storm at nothing, over and over, its coils shrieking at the heat blur of the dust itself, while the actual tide flowed in cold and low through the gap 40 meters down the line, where its arc didn't reach. Then the screaming started from the Pell claim, 2 over from ours, which was one of the far households that hadn't drawn in. My mother had the household comm on, the colony net that tied the claims to the commons in the season, and it had become a thing I will hear in bad dreams the rest of my life. It was not one voice. It was the whole frontier coming apart at once, layered over itself, a hauler at the West Arc calling that the drones had stopped tracking, that they were firing on the storm, that the tide was inside. A woman 3 claims down saying a name over and over into the dark. The colony commons trying to raise the far households one by one and getting static and then getting nothing. And under all of it, the flat synthetic voice of the warden's perimeter system itself, reporting over and over in its untroubled machine register that the perimeter was secure, that all arcs were nominal, that engagement was proceeding within parameters. The system did not know it had failed. It had no line for the dead ground. It sat there in the middle of the worst night of the season telling a dying colony that everything was nominal, and I have thought since that there is no truer portrait of the warden's whole way of seeing the world than that flat voice reciting that everything was fine while the tide came in through the gap his certainty had left. My mother keyed the comm and tried to raise the Pell claim and got a child's, screaming in a man's voice shouting that they couldn't hold the buyer door. And then she tried to raise the commons for help and was told, in the strained voice of the warden's clerk, that no one could be sent out into the storm, that the standing order was shelter in place until the system cleared the perimeter, that help would come at first light. First light was hours off. The Pell children did not have hours. The whole colony was bolted behind its doors waiting on a machine that was reporting nominal while it failed, and there was nothing in all of Coldwater Reach that night that was permitted to go out into the tide, because the only thing that could go out into the tide and live was a condemned animal the colony had ruled it would destroy. I have to slow down here, because this is the part the colony remembers in pieces and got wrong in the telling, and I was at the center of it, and I will tell it true. My mother bolted our shutters and put Pell behind the deep cistern and stood at the kitchen hatch with the slug thrower, and she shouted at me to get inside, and I got inside, and Cinder did not. Cinder stood at the hatch facing the dark with the brown storm tearing past him, and the two-note alarm hammering the air, and when I called him, when I said easy, when I said the word that had brought him down off the bars on the worst night of his life, he turned and looked at me, and he did not come. It is the only time in all the years he was mine that he did not come when I called, and I understood, in the cold of that hatchway with my mother screaming at me to bolt it, that he was not disobeying me. He was keeping the promise. The screaming from the Pell claim was a child screaming. There were children inside the circle of his choosing, not just my Pell, but every child of that colony, I think, in the strange large arithmetic of a thing that has decided to be ours. And a child was screaming in the dark, and the warden's drones were firing at the storm, and there was nothing else in all of Coldwater Reach that night that could move out into the tide and live. Go, I told him. I don't know where it came from. I was 12 and terrified, and my mother was hauling at my coat, and I looked at the thing I loved most in the world, and I sent it out into the dark to do the thing it was made for, because it was already going, and the only choice I had was whether the last word it heard from me was fear or faith. Go, Cinder. I've got the door. Go. He went. He went off the step and into the brown wall and was gone, and the storm closed over the place where he had been, and my mother got the hatch bolted, and I put my back to it and slid down it to the floor, and I could not breathe. What happened out there I learned in pieces over the days after, from the Pell family who lived because of it, and from Brooke who went out at the first gray light and read the ground the way only a Vant Pen chief can read ground, and from the warden's own drone logs, which Tolek did not want read aloud, and which got read aloud anyway. I will give it to you the way I assembled it, and then I will give you the part I saw with my own eyes, which is the part that mattered. The tide had 30-some runners through the gap and across the dead ground and onto the Pell claim before any drone so much as turned. The household had bolted, but the runners do not need a door. They go through the stock pens and the buyers, and they come at the soft parts of a claim, the feed stores and the cistern housing, and they were into the buyer and turning toward the house when Cinder hit them. Brooke read it off the ground at dawn and would not stop shaking his head. He did not go through them, the old Vant said. A young one goes through. He went around. He came up out of the storm on the far side, between the tide and the house, and he turned them. He looked at me with something I had never seen on a Vant's heavy face. 40 seasons, boy. A rain fights for its kill or its den. I never once saw one fight for ground it did not need, against a tide it could have walked away from, to put itself between a strange child and the dark. He turned the whole tide off that house and back into the open, alone, in the storm. Brooke was quiet a moment. I would not have believed it of any living thing. I am old, and I have stopped believing in much. I believe in that. The Pell children lived, every one of them, and the tide turned off the soft household and back into the open ground, did the thing a turned tide does. It looked for the next soft thing. And the next soft thing 2 claims over, with its drones still shrieking at the storm and its Fargate not yet fully drawn, was us. I heard them before I saw anything, because there was nothing to see, only the brown wall against the shutters and the perimeter lamps gone to that drowned amber. I heard the grazers in our pen lose their minds all at once. The high tearing sound a herd makes when the thing it has feared its whole life is finally at the rail, and then I heard the rail go, and then I heard the runners in the yard. They sound like nothing. That is the worst of it. A pack of pursuit predators flowing through a yard in the dark make almost no sound at all, just a low scrabbling rush, and the click of claws on the cistern housing and under it, a kind of wet, eager breathing spread out across a space too wide to be one animal. My mother stood at the kitchen hatch, with the slug thrower up and Pell screaming behind the cistern, and me with my back against the bolted door, and a runner hit the door from the outside hard enough to jump the bolt in its bracket, and another hit the shutter, and another, and I understood with a clarity that has never left me that the door was going to come in, and the shutter was going to come in, and the slug thrower had 11 rounds, and there were more than 11 of them, and that we were going to die in our own kitchen on a death world 9 days early. My mother fired through the hatch slot, and a runner screamed, and the others did not so much as pause, the way the tide does not pause, and I was reaching for the cistern to put my own body between it and Pell when the sound in the yard changed. I knew the sound. I will know it on my deathbed. It was the low grind, Cinder's low grind, the one that was not warm, and it came up out of the storm right outside our door, and every other sound in the yard stopped. He had turned the tide off the Pell claim, and he had not gone to ground, and he had not saved himself. He had come home. Through the full dark and the full storm and a tide of 40 starving things, he had come back to the circle, to the last and innermost ring of his choosing, to the door with the boy behind it, and he had put himself in the yard between us and all of it, and he had let the tide know he was there. What happened in our yard I did not see with my eyes, only heard, and I have never been more glad of a closed shutter. I will not give you the gore of it, because there was gore and it does not need telling, and because the thing that mattered was never the violence. The thing that mattered was the shape of the violence. He did not panic. He did not flail. Through the shutter, I could hear the settling word in reverse. I could hear a creature working at the cold, efficient pace of a thing that has decided, that is not afraid, that has all the time in the world because it will not be the one to die here. The tide that had flowed without a front edge, that had no fear because fear was not in its blood, learned fear in our yard that night. I heard it learn. I heard the rush become a scatter, and the scatter become a rout, and the eager wet breathing become a high broken yelping moving away fast into the storm. And then I heard nothing but the wind, and under the wind, the low grind settling, slowing, going quiet. My mother got the hatch open against every rule of the shutter drill, because a mother will, and the lamplight from the kitchen fell out into the yard. And there he stood in the falling dust with the storm tearing past him, ash and ember, copper eyes coming around to find me in the doorway the way they had found me at the pit. And he was, I have to say this plainly, because the warden's people put it about for years that the man-eater must have been savaged, must have been half dead, must surely be put down now for its wounds. He did not have a mark on him, not one. The tide had come, and the tide had broken, and Cinder stood in the wreck of our yard, without so much as a tear in his hide, breathing slow, dust-caked to the color of the ground. And when I came out the door and across the yard, he did the thing he always did. He pressed his great brow to mine, hard, and the grind in his chest went warm, and I put my arms around as much of his neck as my arms would hold. And I said the only thing there was to say, which was easy, easy, I've got you. You came back easy now. And he purred so deep I felt it in the soles of my feet. The drones were still firing at the storm when the gray came up. That detail went into the colony's bones. When the light came and the dust lay down, and the people came out of their bolted houses to count their living and their dead, the warden's ring of automated perimeter wardens was still turning on its tracks and shrieking its coils at the heat blur of the settling dust, firing and firing at nothing, having never once in the whole long night turned to face the actual tide that had flowed in cold and low through the gaps a slate had called sufficient. Brooke's people shut them down by hand. They had to climb up and shut them down by hand because the things had no line in them for stopping. When the threat they were built for had come and gone right through the dead ground, they couldn't. See, there were no human dead at Coldwater Reach that night. I want that on the record above all the rest of it. The far claims that hadn't drawn in lived. The Pell children lived. My family lived. 3 colonies up and down that stretch of frontier lost households that season to this early deep dust, lost them whole, the way you lose things to the tide. Coldwater Reach lost grazers and fence and one shutter and a great deal of the warden's certainty, and it lost not one living soul. And the reason it lost not one living soul was lying across our kitchen hatch by midday with my sister asleep, against his flank and his copper eyes half shut and his great chest going slow, the condemned man-eater, the thing the colony could not govern, the only thing on that whole hard world that had walked out into the worst night of the season and turned the tide with the steady weight of a promise it had decided, through the bars of a killing pit, to keep. The warden came at noon with 2 handlers and his slate. I saw him crossing the open ground from the perimeter, and I came out to the step and stood in front of the hatch where Cinder lay, and my mother came and stood at my shoulder, and Brooke, who had been reading the ground in our yard, straightened up slow and put himself near, and a few of the Vant who had come to help with the fence stopped their work and watched, and some of the human haulers, and a knot of the Oru with their 4 eyes blinking. It was not a crowd, it became one. Word moves on a frontier morning the way the tide moves in the dark, low and wide and without a front edge, and by the time Warden Tulloch reached our step, there were a great many of the colony's people standing in our yard, and every one of them had spent the night behind a bolted door listening to what had stood between them and the dark. Tulloch stopped at the edge of our yard and took the measure of it. The broken rail, the runner sign in the dust, the great ash-colored shape across our hatch, the boy in front of it, the colony at his back. A lesser proud man would have read that yard and gone home quiet. The warden keyed his slate. There was an incident on this claim last night, he said. An apex predator, condemned and held under probationary keeping, engaged in lethal action within the perimeter. Under the terms of the ruling, any incident involving the rain requires its immediate destruction. I am here to carry out the ruling. For a moment nobody spoke, and I felt the old terror come up in me, the pit terror, because the man had a slate, and the slate had a line, and on a frontier a slate line can kill a thing as dead as any tide. It was my mother who spoke first, and she did not raise her voice. The ruling, she said, is for harm to a colonist, Warden. Read it back. Immediate destruction on any incident of harm to a colonist. Whose harm exactly? Name the colonist Cinder harmed last night. We'll wait while you find the line. Tolik's ridge went the dark gray. He scrolled the slate. The ruling said what my mother said it said, because she had stood in that long hall and listened to every cold word of it 9 days running, and a careful woman remembers the words that were meant to kill what her son loved. There was no colonist harmed. There was, instead, a yard full of colonists who had not been harmed, and every one of them knew exactly why. The terms are immaterial, the warden said, changing his ground the way men do when the first ground gives. The animal has now killed at scale, 30-40 kills in a single night. It is more dangerous today than it was in the pit, not less. A thing that can do what was done in this yard cannot be permitted to live among children. That is not a slate line, that is sense. It killed night runners, I said. I was 12, my voice cracked on it, and I did not care. It killed the tide that was coming through your fence to eat us. You want to put him down for being good enough at the one thing the whole colony needed him to be good at. It is a man-eater, boy, Tolik said. And there it was, the old word, the word from the pit. The word he had been holding all season like the last card a losing man keeps face down. It killed handlers. It is in its nature. Last night it turned its nature on the tide. The next bad night it turns its nature on you. I have read 100 reports of bonded death world predators, and they end the same way, everyone. You are a child, and you do not know what you are sleeping beside. Read the report on last night, said Brooke. The old Vant said it quiet. The way he said everything, but a yard, goes silent for a Vant pen chief the way it does not for a warden. And Tolik made the mistake of his life, which was to answer. The drone slugs are colony property and not. Read them, Brooke said. You came here with a slate full of last night. Read the part of it where your ring of perimeter wardens that cost this colony 3 seasons of levy turned to face the tide. Read the timestamp. We'll wait the way you had us wait on the ruling. The old Vant looked around the yard, slow at the faces. I climbed up and shut them down at first light. They were still firing at the dust. I have the count of what they killed in your logs, Warden. Read the colony the count of what your drones killed last night, and then read them the count of what that animal killed, and let the people do the arithmetic you are afraid of. Tolik did not read the logs. He did not have to. The not reading was the whole answer, and the yard had it. But the logs got read anyway 3 days later in the long hall. When the colony called the season review the warden had hoped to chair and instead found himself answering, and the count went into the colony's bones the way the firing at the storm had. The warden's ring of automated perimeter wardens, the pride he had spoken of like a son, had killed 4 night runners across the whole of the worst night of the season, all 4 in the open where the arcs reached, none in the dead ground where the tide actually came. And the condemned rain, designated specimen 11, kept under probationary keeping subject to immediate destruction, had turned 2 tides off 2 households and broken a third in a yard, alone, in the storm, and had not taken a wound doing it, and had killed. Brooke would not give a number, said no honest count was possible, said only that the ground past the Pell claim and the open beyond our fence told a story a man could read for a long while and not reach the end of. But that was 3 days off. In the yard that noon, the warden had run out of ground. He looked at me and at the great ash-colored shape behind me, and he made one last reach for the one thing he had left, which was fear. You think it minds you, he said. You think because it lies on your hatch and lets the small one sleep on it that it is yours, that it answers to you. It answers to its nature, boy, and one day its nature and your word will point 2 different ways, and on that day you will learn what I have always known. Tell it to stand off. Go on. There are 40 colonists watching. Tell your man-eater to stand down off that hatch and come to me, and we will all see how much it minds you. I have thought about why he said it. I think he believed Cinder would not move for me, that the bond was the thing he'd called it in the long hall, acquisition, instinct, a predator's claim on a keeper, and that a word from a boy would mean nothing against the nature he'd staked his whole season on. I think he wanted the yard to see the beast ignore me, so that the fear would do what his slate could not. It was, I have come to understand, the single most foolish thing a proud man could have asked for, and he asked for it in front of the entire colony, and I gave it to him. I turned around. Cinder was already up. He had come up off the hatch when the warden's voice sharpened, the way he had always come up at a sharp voice, his copper eyes finding me first, checking, the way they always did. I did not have to think about what to do. I had been doing it all season. I dropped my voice low, and even the settling word, not a command, never a command, a promise, and I said, easy now, easy, stay close, and I crouched, and I held out my hand the way I had held it out through the bars on the worst night of his life. He came to me. Of course he came to me. He crossed the yard in front of 40 witnesses and a warden with a slate, and he put his great brow against my palm, hard, and the grind in his chest came up warm and deep enough that the people nearest took a step back from the sound of it, and he turned, without my asking, so that his shoulder was at my head and his copper eyes were on the warden, and he sat. He sat at my left hand in the wreck of our yard, the man-eater the colony had condemned, calm as the cistern, and waited to see what I wanted, and the whole of Coldwater Reach saw a condemned apex predator choose a human child on the record in the daylight after the worst night of the season, and not one slate in that yard had a line for it. Warden Tolek stood in our yard with his slate in his hand and nowhere left to put his certainty. He could have killed Cinder anyway. I have thought about that too in the years since. He had the authority on paper, twisted hard enough, and he had 2 handlers with shock poles, and a proud man backed into a yard full of people who have just watched him be wrong will sometimes reach for the worst thing simply to prove he can. Still reach for something. I braced for it. I had my hand in Cinder's fur and I felt the cable come up under it, felt the great body go still and ready. Not because I had asked, but because he read the warden the way he read everything, and I knew, with the cold clarity of the night before, that if Tolek gave the word and a handler raised a pole, the season would end in our yard in a way none of us would walk back from. It was Brooke who gave the warden his way out, and I have always thought it was a kinder thing than Tolek deserved. "Warden," the old Vance said, "the colony will want the season review done proper, in the hall with the logs. That's your right and your duty to chair. There's no call to settle it standing in a wrecked yard over a tired animal and a frightened boy. Bring it to the hall, bring the logs. Let it be done the colony's way." He paused, and the pause did the work. "The colony's way has served you all season. It would be a poor time to set it down." Tolek looked at the yard one more time. He looked at the count he had not read aloud, and the colonists who already knew it without reading. He looked at the boy and the beast at the boy's left hand, the thing he could not file and could not govern, and now in front of everyone, could not even frighten. And he keyed his slate, and he said, in the flat voice of a man laying down a card he has finally understood is worthless, "The matter will be reviewed in the hall," and he turned and walked back across the open ground the way he had come, and his 2 handlers came after him with their shock poles pointed at the dust. And that was the last time Warden Tolek ever stood on the marsh claim. The review filled the long hall the way the worst night had filled the dark. Every species of the colony in its cluster, the heat lamps buzzing, and no empty bench, because there is nothing a frontier turns out for like the accounting of a season it barely lived through. Tolek chaired it because it was his right to chair it, and I have wondered since whether a wiser man would have found a reason to be elsewhere, but pride does not let a man leave the room where he is about to be measured. He opened it the way he opened everything, with the slate, with the figures, with the season's losses laid out clean, the grazers, the fence, the far claims up and down the stretch that the early deep had taken whole. He read it well. He was building, I understood even then, toward the recommendation he meant to leave the hall with, the one he had carried all season. That the colony's survival had hung by too thin a thread, that the perimeter must be hardened, that a bonded apex predator in a household of children was a liability the next bad night would collect. He was most of the way there when Brooke stood up. "Read the drone logs," the old Vance said. "The logs will be summarized in the perimeter findings." "Read them," Brooke said, "the way the boy's mother had you read the ruling, the timestamps, the kill count. Read the colony what its drones did between the 2nd hour and the dawn, and then read what they did not do, and let the hall hold the 2 numbers in the same hand." He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "You called the review, Warden. Call it honest." Tolek could have refused. He had the chair. But a chair is only worth what the room agrees it is worth. And the room had gone the particular kind of quiet that tells a man the agreement is already slipping. And so he read them. He read them flat, the way you read your own sentence. Between the 2nd hour and the dawn, the warden's ring of automated perimeter wardens, requisitioned at 3 seasons of colony levy, had engaged the heat blur of the settling dust 411 times and had killed 4 night runners, all 4 in the open South Arc where the geometry reached, none in the dead ground where the tide had actually flowed. And the rain-designated specimen 11, condemned, held under a ruling of immediate destruction, had turned the tide off the Pell claim and broken it in the marsh yard and taken. Brooke would still give no honest number, but the ground past the fence told its own count, and the hall did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was the end of the warden. Veshin's finding was entered into the record then, read out by the clerk in the authority's own cold language. Clean fixation bond will not turn the literature wrong, and I watched it land on the warden the way a slate line lands, with the weight he had always given them, except this time the line was about him. The drones that had cost 3 seasons of levy were written down as insufficient to the threat, which is the coldest sentence a colony slate can write about a thing a man has loved like a son, and they were not requisitioned again, and the ruling on Cinder was struck in the same session by a hall that could not strike it fast enough, and the warden was not asked to chair the next season review, and within the year the colonial authority had moved him to a station posting where his slates could not get anything killed that mattered. He did not lose his rank. Men like Tolik rarely do. He lost the thing the frontier values above rank, which is the belief of the people that he knew what he was talking about. And on a frontier that is the whole of a man, and the loss of it is a kind of death that lets you keep breathing. The ruling on Cinder was struck. There was talk of a commendation, which the Vant found very funny, the idea of pinning a colony commendation on a rain. And Brooke said the only commendation a rain recognized was a steady voice in a place by the door, and he was right. And Cinder had both, and that was the end of the matter on the slates. It was not the end of it in the colony. The frontier makes doctrine out of one true thing it has seen with its own eyes. And what Coldwater Reach had seen was a tide turned by a thing that did not roar, and the name for that thing was already in their mouths. The settling word stopped being a way of talking to spooked stock and became, in that small, hard way, a thing the colony believed. When the next deep dust came, and the one after, and the colony rebuilt its perimeter the old way, with people on the fence instead of slates, you would hear it down the line in the dark, the haulers and the Vant and the Oru and the human children passing it shoulder to shoulder as the lamps went amber, easy, settle, hold, I've got you, a low even register handed person to person against the tide. The colony steadying itself the way a frightened animal steadies to a voice that has decided not to be afraid. They did not always know where it came from. By the time I was grown, most of them didn't. It had become the colony's the way the truest things do, and I never once told them it had started through the bars of a killing pit on the night before they meant to put a name to the count and call it sense. My father came home off the long haul at the turn of the season, 3 weeks after the early deep dust, and he came up the track to a claim with a broken rail and a new shutter and a story he could not get the colony to stop telling him, and he stood at the gate a long while, looking at the great ash-colored shape on the kitchen step, with his 7-year-old daughter asleep against its flank and his son sitting in the dust with his hand in its fur. My father was not a man who frightened, but he was a man who had worked the deep pens in his own young years, and he knew what a rain was, and he stood at that gate a careful while. That's the man-eater they were going to cull, he said. The one your letters were about. That's Cinder, I said. He came up the track slow, the way you come up on a thing you respect, and he crouched down a body length off, and Cinder lifted his head and took the measure of him, copper eyes going from my father to me and back checking, the way he always checked, and I said low and even, easy, he's ours, he's mine. And my father held out his hand, palm down, the way the Vant had taught him 40 seasons gone, and Cinder leaned across and pressed his great brow to it, once hard, and my father let out a breath he had been holding, I think, since the gate. Well, my father said. He scratched the rough fur behind the great ear the way you'd scratch any old dog that had earned it, and the grind came up warm and deep, and my little sister stirred against the ash-colored flank and did not wake. Well, I'll be. The next deep dust came on its proper mark the following year, and the colony met it the old way, because the new way was rust in a yard and a sentence on a slate. There were no drones on the fence. There were people on the fence, the haulers and the Vant pen crews and the human men and the Oru up on the gate stands with their 4 eyes reading. The dark and the lamps went amber at dusk, and the 2-note alarm came up when the outriders hit the south arc. And this time the colony did not stand behind a machine and hope. It stood in the gap itself, and it held, and the thing that held it was not a weapon. I was on the south fence with my father, and Cinder was at my left hand, and when the first of the tide came low and spread through the dust, I felt the cable come up under my palm, and I said the word, low and even, easy, hold, and the man beside me, a hauler I barely knew, took it up without thinking, easy, hold, settle, and passed it down. And it went the length of the fence in the dark the way the fear had once gone, except it was the opposite of fear. It was the settling word, a low, even register handed shoulder to shoulder against the tide, easy, settle, hold, I've got you. A whole colony steadying itself with the voice you use on a frightened animal in the dark, because they had watched a boy use it on the most frightened and most lethal thing on the world and live, and the line held. Cinder anchored the south arc the way he would anchor it every deep season for 11 years, the gap the slate could never cover, filled by the thing the slate had condemned, and the tide broke on the fence and the settling word both, and not one soul of Coldwater Reach was lost to the dark again while he lived. The colony never quite knew, in the years after, where its steadiest word had come from. It had become theirs. The truest things do. I would hear grown men I had never met passing it down a fence line in a season I was not even on the claim for easy. Hold, I've got you. And I would think of a frozen haunch of meat and a killing cold and a copper eye that had found me through the bars and decided, and I would say nothing and walk on. Cinder lived 11 more seasons. I want that here at the end plain, because so many stories of a boy and the beast that loved him end the way the warden wanted ours to end, with the thing put down on a slate line, with the lethal nature finally turning, with a lesson about the cold way the world works. Ours did not. He lived 11 seasons and turned the tide more times than I have the words to count. And he never harmed one of ours, and he never lost a wound he could not walk off, and he was old and gray-muzzled and slow-blinking on the kitchen step in the warm of his last season, with my sister grown and gone to her own claim and my own children sleeping against his flank the way she once had, and he went the way an old chosen thing should go, in his sleep by the door, with the lamp's amber and a low even voice telling him easy, now easy, I've got you, the same word that had brought him down off the bars on the first night, keeping its half of the promise to the last. People still ask me, the few that are left who were there, how a boy with 2 empty pails earned a thing like that. They want a method. They want the trick of it, the chemistry, the slate line. There isn't one. I have lived a long life out past the perimeter, and I have learned the one thing the warden never could. The thing Brooke knew at 40 seasons, and I learned at 12 in a killing cold with a frozen haunch of meat against my chest. That the things this world condemns as too dangerous to keep are, on the worst night of all, the only things that will walk out into the dark and stand in the gap. That a creature can be everything they say it is, lethal, unkillable, made for nothing but the kill, and still choose once for life and keep that choosing past every reason to break it. The colony could not govern him. They were right about that every word. They never understood that they didn't have to. He had chosen, and a chosen thing does not need to be governed. It only needs a steady voice in the dark and a place by the door, and it will give you back, against any tide that ever comes, the whole of what it is. Easy now, I told him, the first night and the last, I've got you. He had me too. He had all of us, the whole hard length of that frontier, and he never once let go.